Vivienne Moreau was 41 years old the evening her husband of 9 years sat across from her at their kitchen table, folded his hands the way a man does when he has rehearsed what he is about to say, and told her she deserved better than the life she was living with him. He had meant it as a kindness. That was the part she would remember the longest. He had delivered it gently, almost tenderly, the way a person sets down something fragile before they walk away from it. He said she was too good for him. He said she deserved more than he could give. He said he had found someone who matched where he was in life, and that he hoped Vivienne would understand. The woman he had found was named Gwendolyn Park. She was a pharmaceutical sales director with a downtown Charlotte apartment, a leased European sedan, and the particular confidence of someone who has recently been told she is the better option. She had been the better option, by his accounting, for 14 months. Vivienne had listened to all of it without interrupting. When Lawrence finished, she said she appreciated his honesty. She asked him to have his attorney contact hers. Then she stood, cleared the 2 coffee cups from the table, set them in the sink, and drove to her office. He had filed his petition by Friday morning. His financial disclosure listed her as a pharmaceutical researcher at a mid-size contract lab with a salary of $94,000. The disclosure was not inaccurate about the salary. It was missing a number of other things. Among them, a private biotech portfolio she had built over 17 years, 4 licensed patents generating royalty income, and a controlling stake in a medical research holding company that her attorney's most recent valuation placed at $312 million. What Lawrence had filed to leave was not what he thought he was leaving. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The lab coat hanging on the back of Vivienne's office door was not decorative. She wore it most days and washed it herself on Sunday evenings and hung it back on the same hook where it had lived for 6 years. The office itself was modest in the way that certain spaces are modest, because the person who occupies them has never found any use for display. A whiteboard covered in compound structures she updated weekly. 2 long bookshelves she had built herself from pine boards and steel brackets on a Saturday, when the furniture she had ordered was delayed and she needed the shelving that afternoon. A single window facing north because she had chosen the office for the light it did not have, the kind of steady, indirect illumination that was easiest on extended work sessions. She was a biochemist. She had been one, in one form or another, since the summer she was 19, and had spent 3 months working in her Uncle Gerald's research lab in Durham, because he had told her that the best way to know whether she wanted to spend her life doing something was to spend a summer doing it. And she had spent that summer doing it, and known by August that she did. Gerald was 74 now, and still kept an active lab, and she called him every other Sunday and they talked for an hour, usually about work, occasionally about other things, always unhurried. He had told her once, in the middle of a conversation about a compound she was struggling to stabilize, "Vivienne, the variable you cannot control is always the one that reveals the most. Don't rush past it. Sit with it until you understand what it is telling you." She had applied that instruction to organic chemistry. She had also applied it to her marriage. She had met Lawrence at a charity benefit in the 4th year of her postdoctoral work, a quiet evening in a hotel ballroom where he was representing a corporate law firm and she was attending with a colleague. He was composed and well-spoken and curious in the way that lawyers sometimes are, asking precise follow-up questions rather than moving the conversation immediately back toward himself. He had asked about her research and seemed genuinely interested in the answer, which was not a common experience for her at parties, and she had found the quality worth noting. They had dated for 2 years and married simply, a small ceremony at Gerald's house in Durham with 30 people, and a dinner her aunt had organized in the backyard. The first years of their marriage were productive and companionable. Lawrence built his practice. Vivienne built her research portfolio. They lived in a house in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte that she had purchased in her name before the wedding. A craftsman bungalow with a garden she maintained in the early mornings before her lab hours began. She grew tomatoes and one fig tree that her father had planted from a cutting before he died, and that she tended with the attention she gave every long-term project, consistently, without drama, trusting the process. The trouble had arrived not as a single event, but as a slow withdrawal of presence. Lawrence had begun working later, which she had not questioned, because she understood the rhythm of demanding professional lives. He had begun traveling more, which she had also not questioned. What she had noted, with the precision she brought to variables she did not yet understand, was a shift in the quality of his attention. He was present in the house but no longer present with her, and those were two different things, and she had known the difference for long enough to trust her own observation. The thing she had noticed first was a conference registration confirmation that had arrived in their shared calendar for a pharmaceutical industry summit in Raleigh. Lawrence was not in the pharmaceutical industry. She had not asked him about it. She had simply remembered it. That was in April. He filed in October. The sequence, in retrospect, was not difficult to reconstruct. She had not needed a dramatic revelation. She had needed only what she always needed: time, observation, and the patience to let the variable tell her what it was. The discovery came the way discoveries often did for her, not through confrontation, but through method. She had been reviewing her own financial records in September, 6 weeks before Lawrence filed, looking for documentation to update a trust instrument her attorney had flagged for annual review. In pulling those records, she had opened a folder that contained, among other things, the original documentation from the joint account they had maintained for household expenses. She had not looked at it closely in some time, because the household expenses had never been a concern, but something in the October statement caught her attention. A charge from a jewelry store in the South Park area on a Saturday when Lawrence had told her he was at a firm golf outing. Her face remained perfectly calm. She pulled the previous 12 months of statements and went through them line by line with the same systematic attention she brought to a data set that was producing unexpected results. Start at the beginning. Look for the pattern. Do not assume you know what you are looking for before you have looked. What she found was a pattern of charges that, taken individually, were unremarkable. A restaurant, a hotel bar, a florist, a weekend spa booking in Asheville during a trip she had not been invited on. Taken together, across 11 months, they formed a record of a parallel life being maintained on shared money, $5,200 in aggregate, not large enough to trigger any alarm she had been watching for, but legible as a pattern once she was looking. She photographed each statement with her phone and forwarded them to a personal folder she had maintained for years under a name that was not her own. Then she closed the banking portal and returned to the trust documentation she had originally opened. Her hands did not shake. She went back further. She requested records from a brokerage account Lawrence had opened 4 years into the marriage, which she had access to under the joint financial disclosure they had completed during a mortgage refinancing, and which Lawrence had apparently forgotten she possessed. The records showed a series of transfers over 16 months, incremental, never more than $8,000 in a single move, totaling $61,000 drawn toward an account she traced to a holding address registered to Gwendolyn Park. He had not only been conducting the relationship, he had been funding it. She closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. The fig tree in the garden at home would be setting its last fruit of the season. She thought about her father's hands pressing the cutting into the soil. She thought about Gerald telling her to sit with the variable until she understood what it was telling her. She understood. She made one call. She said, quietly, "Patricia, I need you to pull everything we have on record for the Morrow Trust portfolio and have it ready for a full disclosure review." Patricia Elkins had been Vivienne's attorney for 11 years, which was to say she had been her attorney for longer than Lawrence had been her husband, and she had a working knowledge of Vivienne's complete financial architecture that no one else on earth possessed. She said, without inflection, "I'll have it ready by Thursday." Vivienne said, "Thank you." She hung up and went back to her whiteboard and finished the compound notation she had been working on when the statements had interrupted her. Because the work did not wait, and she had always found that the work was the most reliable thing she had. Knowledge does not announce itself. It simply becomes available to those who are paying attention. Patricia's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Trade Street in uptown Charlotte, and she kept it the way she kept everything, organized with a kind of precision that suggested she knew exactly where every document was, because she had placed it there deliberately and expected to need it. When Vivienne arrived on Thursday morning with her folder of statement photographs and the brokerage records, Patricia reviewed them with a speed that indicated she had already been thinking about what they might contain. She set the last page down and said, "The brokerage transfers are recoverable under equitable distribution. The fraudulent characterization of those funds as personal income in his disclosure creates additional exposure." She paused. "More importantly, his financial disclosure listed your assets as your researcher's salary. He did not disclose anything further." Vivienne said, "He doesn't know about anything further." Patricia looked at her for a moment. It was not the look of a woman who was surprised. It was the look of a woman who had just confirmed something she had long suspected. "He has filed a petition," Patricia said, "based on a picture of your finances that is approximately $311 million incomplete." Vivienne nodded. "I'd like to respond to that petition." "You will," Patricia said, "and when we do, we will file a complete asset disclosure for your side of the ledger." She aligned the papers before her into a clean stack. "I want you to understand what that moment is going to feel like for the other party." Vivienne said, "I've spent 17 years making things in a lab that most people don't understand until they see the result. I'm familiar with that moment." 3 days passed. Patricia's team compiled the counter-disclosure. Vivienne's private biotech portfolio had been built over 17 years from her own earnings, structured entirely in premarital and separately held accounts, never commingled with marital funds. It contained 4 licensed patents on delivery mechanism compounds that generated royalty payments from 3 pharmaceutical manufacturers. It contained a controlling 54% stake in Morrow Research Holdings, a medical research company she had co-founded 9 years earlier, and which had, in the previous fiscal year, posted revenues of $47 million. The most recent independent valuation of her combined holdings, prepared 6 months prior for an investment review, placed the total at $312 million. None of this was secret. It had simply never come up, because Lawrence had never asked, and Vivienne had never found a reason to volunteer the particulars of a financial life she had built before she met him and maintained entirely on its own axis throughout their marriage. She had not hidden anything. She had simply not been asked. The counter-evidence that Patricia surfaced in the following days completed the picture on Lawrence's side. The $61,000 in brokerage transfers to the holding address registered to Gwendolyn Park had been made, on 6 of the 11 instances, on the same dates as documented wire transfers from a client trust account Lawrence managed. Patricia's forensic review, conducted quietly through a specialist she had used before, identified that 2 of those transfers had been processed through an account where Lawrence had signature authority that he was not authorized to use for personal distributions. The total potentially misappropriated amount was $23,000. That number was not large in the context of the broader case, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with its size, because it converted Lawrence's comfortable narrative of a man seeking something better into a more legally complicated situation than he had apparently planned for. That weekend, Vivienne went home and worked in the garden on Saturday morning, clearing the last of the summer growth from the beds her father had taught her to maintain. Lawrence was at the house through the weekend. She made meals and answered his questions and asked none of her own, because there was nothing left that she needed to know, and nothing she was prepared to give away. He seemed to believe the proceedings were moving in the direction he had planned. He seemed comfortable. He was performing for an audience that had already reviewed the results and drawn its conclusions. She pulled the last of the summer tomatoes from the vine on Sunday afternoon and set them on the kitchen counter, red and full, still warm from the sun. Lawrence walked through the kitchen and said they looked good. She thanked him. She finished her work in the garden as the afternoon light shifted, and she thought about the compound on her whiteboard and the variable that always revealed the most, and she was calm in the complete and total way that only comes when you already know the answer. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. The mediation took place in Patricia's conference room on a Thursday morning in December. Lawrence arrived with his attorney, a senior partner from his own firm, who had been given, Vivienne suspected, a curated version of the available information. Gwendolyn Park was not present. It was the correct choice. Lawrence had the posture of a man who had prepared his position and expected the proceedings to proceed more or less as he had outlined them. He had filed as the party in a position of generosity. He was leaving. He was being kind. He had already, in his own accounting, won the moral framing of the situation. Patricia placed the cover page of Vivienne's counter-disclosure in the center of the table. She placed the portfolio summary behind it. The 4 patents. The royalty agreements with the 3 manufacturers. The Morrow Research Holdings operating summary. The independent valuation. $312 million, documented, dated, and organized with the precision of 17 years of meticulous record-keeping. She placed the brokerage transfer records behind that. The $61,000 to Gwendolyn Park's holding address. The 6 transfers that aligned with client trust activity. The forensic summary. The $23,000 figure, underlined. The table was quiet. Lawrence's attorney reviewed the valuation page first. He was a controlled man, and he maintained his expression with professional care. But he picked up his pen and set it down again without writing anything, which told Vivienne what she needed to know. Lawrence looked at the summary. He looked at it for a long time. His attorney leaned toward him and said something at a volume that did not carry across the table, and Lawrence shook his head once. Slowly, the movement of a man recalibrating a figure he had been certain of. He said, finally, across the table, "Vivienne, I didn't know." She said, "I know." He said, "If I had known," and then stopped, because his attorney placed a hand on his arm, and because the sentence he was about to finish could not be finished in a room with legal witnesses without making his situation considerably worse. Vivienne looked at him with the same steady attention she brought to every variable she was preparing to document and set aside. She said, "You asked me for 9 years what I was working on, and I told you, and you nodded and moved on. I didn't hide a single thing from you. You simply weren't listening." She picked up her copy of the settlement terms. "I'd like to finish." The settlement terms were precise, as Patricia's terms always were. full return of his documented contribution to the marital estate, equitably calculated. Recovery of the $61,000 in transferred funds, with interest. A notation in the proceedings regarding the client trust transfers referred to the appropriate bar review body for determination as to whether further inquiry was warranted. No claim against Vivienne's premarital portfolio, which had been independently structured and documented from its origin, and was untouchable by any reasonable reading of the equitable distribution statutes. The Craftsman bungalow, which she had purchased before the wedding and maintained throughout the marriage, remained entirely hers. Lawrence signed before noon. His attorney gathered the documents with the economy of motion that belonged to a man who wished he were somewhere else, and the room emptied with the quiet efficiency of a meeting that had gone only one way from the moment the disclosure landed on the table. Vivienne picked up her portfolio and stood. She did not look at Lawrence again. She walked down the hall and took the elevator to the lobby and stepped out into a December morning that was cold and clear and entirely, precisely, hers. She drove. 14 months later, Vivienne sat in the garden at the Dilworth house in the early morning, the kind of February morning that was cold but bright, her coffee in both hands, watching the fig tree across the yard hold the pale light the way trees do in winter, spare and patient, its structure visible now without leaves to soften it. Her father had planted that cutting 22 years ago, before he knew he was running out of time to plant things, and it had grown into the corner of the yard where he had placed it with the particular rootedness of something that had found exactly the right soil. She had, in the 14 months since the mediation, completed the licensing agreement for a 5th patent, expanded Morrow Research Holdings into 2 new therapeutic focus areas, and accepted an appointment to the board of a research foundation that Gerald had been quietly suggesting she join, for 3 years. The combined valuation of her holdings, updated in January by the same independent firm, had crossed $340 million. She noted this the way she noted any data point, accurately and without fanfare, as a measure of where the work had arrived and an indication of where it was going. She had heard, through a colleague who moved in adjacent professional circles, that Lawrence had separated from his firm in the fall, under circumstances described publicly as a transition to independent practice, and described privately, by people who knew, as the consequence of the Bar Review referral and its findings. Gwendolyn Park had relocated to a position in another state. His mother had called Vivienne twice since the mediation, once in the spring and once at the holidays, for conversations that had nothing to do with Lawrence, and everything to do with the fact that some relationships are not dissolved simply because the legal instrument connecting them has been. Vivienne had taken both calls willingly. Darius Webb, a research strategist she had met at a conference in October, had asked her to dinner at the end of a panel discussion on translational research funding. Not at the event, not in front of an audience, but afterward in the hallway as the room was clearing, with the quiet directness of someone who had decided what he wanted to say and said it without performance. He was a thoughtful man who understood her work and found it interesting and did not require her to explain why it mattered. They had dinner 4 times since October, and each one had lasted as long as it needed to, and she had not found it necessary to be in a hurry about any of it. The garden was bare in February, but it was not empty. Under the turned soil at the base of the raised beds were the bulbs she had pressed in during the fall, not visible, not yet arrived, but there and accounted for and moving at their own pace. Gerald called on Sunday mornings. She was always available. The fig tree stood in the corner of the yard the way it had always stood, unhurried, productive in its season, indifferent to whether anyone was watching. She had built what she had built. She had kept what was worth keeping. The rest had resolved itself according to the laws that governed all systems. The ones built on an incomplete picture eventually encounter the complete one. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. The work continued. It always had. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.